Hello, listeners, and welcome to The World This Week. This week we shall be discussing the current relationships between Russia and NATO, which will be presented by Helena, and we'll also be talking about far-right movements in Europe, which Stella is going to be presenting. And then we'll have the Global Beer by Sean, as well as potentially some time to talk about doing drugs and the right way to legalize it. So let's start off straight away with Helena. So Helena, would you like to introduce your topic?
Thank you, Hanek. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the recent verbal confrontation between Russia and NATO. In light of the recent escalations in the Ukraine conflict, Russia and NATO entered a verbal confrontation at the Munich Security Conference on the 13th of February. Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev said that the relationships between Russia and NATO have gone back to a new Cold War, accusing NATO of having an unfriendly and not transparent policy. Earlier at the conference, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg had presented a plan for extensive military buildup on the East Flank. While emphasizing that relations with Russia is to be based on defense as well as dialogue, NATO rejects the Cold War comparisons. Nevertheless, both sides have on several occasions expressed a desire to cooperate on issues like terrorism and the Syria conflict. Indeed, President Obama and President Putin met on the 14th of February, the day after the Security Conference, and agreed to intensify joint diplomatic efforts, military cooperation, and aid deliveries in Syria. In the meeting initiated by Obama, Putin suggested to combat global terrorism together in a united international front. Yet, the two big powers disagree on who Russia is really fighting against on Syrian ground. The same mistrust is expressed in the question of whether Russia is backing separatists in Ukraine. The Russia-NATO relationship can indeed be described as an ambiguous mix of defense and dialogue. On the one side, they seek to deter each other, on the other, they seek cooperation, and it seems like trust issues keep coming in between. So let's go back to the claims about going back to a Cold War. Can these be justified? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think we're going into a new Cold War. It's unlikely in the sense of the present day that while Russia still has clout, it doesn't have that much clout, and it's probably more talk than anything else from what I see the situation as.
Yeah, and I find it puzzling that he would use that phrase when they at the same time claim to be trying to cooperate with each other. So I can help speculating that could it be to gain support from the people within Russia? I mean, are they losing support? Are they trying to win back the people by appearing strong on the international arena? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's actually a very true point. When it comes to the domestic side for Russian foreign policy, it's a bit of an oxymoron there, but Putin is seen as a strong leader and a very good force in Russia, and how he's brought the country from the doldrums back into prominent world stage, and how well the country has grown during the time underneath his reign.
Yeah. So let's talk about the implication Russia-NATO relations have on the Syria conflict. As I said, they are going for cooperation there, but yet the US and NATO are accusing Russia for attacking civilians on ground that are fighting the government in Syria. So whether Russia and NATO decide to cooperate or not, I'm sure that could really change the course of the conflict, because right now you have Russia that's in there backing Assad on some points. Then you have the opposition fighting against that. You have NATO, or not directly NATO, but you have US and other Western forces in there backing the opposition and fighting ISIS. And Russia is also claiming to be fighting ISIS. So you have all these different actors within Syria. So it's clear that some coordination is needed in order to get somewhere with this conflict. So what do you think are the prospects of NATO-Russia? Do you think they're going to get over their trust issues and actually be able to cooperate on these issues?
I would consider cooperation a good idea, everyone probably. But I, for one, do not think that the Ukraine conflict has ended or has yet to end, and thus the cooperation, in my opinion, is still not an option. Because there is no actual common ground between Western and Russia.
Are you talking about Ukraine conflict in specific, or just in general?
What do you mean in general?
Well, I would say that there is a lot of common ground here. They're talking about fighting against terrorism. I think that's the most, that's what they can actually get together and fight against. So we'll have to see if they can get over other issues in order to go on and fight against terrorism. But then, as you say, Ukraine is a different story. They are still very much on different sides of that conflict, and it seems difficult to reach an agreement. They failed to do that on this Munich Security Conference that was 3 days ago.
Yeah, I do agree that with what you said, but it's like what I said was like specifically for the Ukraine conflict, because this was what cooperation between the two was about.
I don't think cooperation is really likely. I mean, you're looking at Russia on their own, dealing with NATO as a whole organisation. There's no way that you're going to have both of them be able to reach common points and everything. NATO's want to negotiate, carefully plan every attack. Russia's just ready to get in there and has proven it before, that they're ready just to actually do stuff, and being on their own, they're able to do it without being bogged down with all this debate on how it should be done. So unless by some weird way Russia finds its way into NATO, I don't think there's ever going to be any full cooperation on any issue concerning any conflict, to be honest.
Well, I think we should be careful saying that NATO is able to carefully plan things while Russia could just get in there. I mean, that sounds very brutal. Yeah, because NATO is also involved in many military operations. Not just Russia is inside Syria, but still, if NATO is not directly involved in Syria, then certainly NATO members are, as well as other countries. And NATO, I mean, they are building up military capabilities on the east flank, and it's understandable that Russia could see that as some kind of, maybe not a direct threat, but they see it as hostile. But then NATO on NATO's side will say that no, this is to assure our allies on the east flank in light of what has happened in Ukraine, because some may fear that Russia is pushing boundaries and trying to maybe even expand more, not just in Ukraine, which NATO are accusing them of doing.
Well, when you're talking about Russia expanding, or trying to expand, it has expanded. I mean, it's very hard to see a situation in the foreseeable future that the Crimea is going to be handed back to the Ukraine, and quite frankly, I don't see Russia giving up on its support of the
territorial independence.
The territorial independence of the eastern side of Ukraine, and I see them continuing to support them in what they would call aid. But as time is ticking on, we're going to have to end that lovely discussion there and move on to Stella's topic. So again, we'd like to remind all the listeners what we're about to discuss.
Thank you, Henrik. We're going to discuss the rise of far-right parties in Europe, but also outside Europe, but mostly inside Europe. I would begin with a small reminder of how Hitler's rise occurred. Briefly, people found that due to economic the economic circumstances at the time, they had no other political solution. They were in political deadlock, and the only person they thought they could trust was Hitler. Nowadays, we've specified it in German. Nowadays, in many countries, including Germany, who has this historical background, fascism begins to rise. First of all, since immigration is today's news, Islamization is crucially considered as a factor of supporting far-right parties. Many countries, not just Greece or Italy, where the influx of citizens occurs, but other countries such as Germany, and Sweden as well, which are the target point where the refugees want to go, as the final destinations. There, in such countries as well, there is a rise of far-right parties. Refugees are considered a challenge to those countries, and the people can see this as well. They feel that they are not being listened to, and they feel in open revolt against their leaders, not just in terms of immigration, but as well in terms of different kinds of politics and legislation, maybe, or political orientation within the government and the governmental apparatus. The sense of injustice and political deadlock is as well today a crucial factor giving rise to such far-right organizations. Last but not least, in this brief summary of the reasons that have led to this rise, the injustice within the European Union in the distribution of mostly the refugees, but in the equality of the countries within the EU, makes countries such as Germany have this rise. For example, let's take Germany, which is a country having a legislation preventing Nazi ideology. Germany takes more refugees than any other country. It's considered to take more refugees than any other country in the EU. They have objections. They've raised objections such as this of the United Kingdom not taking enough refugees, about them being considered the dictators of the European Union, and all these factors combined can be considered the main cause of the rise of far-right parties there. Hungary is as well, for which we know that it has a really strict policy towards the refugees. In Hungary, anti-Semitic feelings have grown. For example, in a football game between Hungary and Israel, fans booed Israel's anthem. They shouted fascist leaders' names, and they attacked the Israel anti-racist movement. We see that there have been movements and actions that violate fundamental human rights of people, and I think we're turning back to an age which is really damaging for the world. Finally, we can have the example of Greece, where the Golden Dawn far-right fascist, it might also be considered a Nazi party, is the third most popular party in the country. The strategy is mainly for gaining people, is mainly giving them what other parties seem to not give them, such as common meals. They give to people. They contribute to their well-being. They give them security. For example, in a recent documentary, I think it was BBC, there were people shown in Greece, and there was this lady owning a store saying that I've been burglared 3 times by non-Greek citizens, not citizens, but people. And unlike the police, the Golden Dawn was immediately there when called. They organize common meals just for white people. They check the papers before giving them food. They consider Greece as a gate to Europe. And since the crisis, the party's statistics have risen dramatically. Finally, far-right parties have connections with the state, the police, and the courts who actually support them. So the government apparatus agrees with the spirit of the Golden Dawn and its actions. And in my opinion, this is why such parties and such organizations are able to rise. What do you think?
I have a comment on something you said earlier. Are you acknowledging that there is a case of Islamization in Europe, or are you saying that far-right movements are using that as an argument?
Yes, I do consider. I do not consider that there is an Islamization in Europe. I think that what I said was that the people and the citizens think that this is what's happening because of the influx of refugees who mostly support Islam.
But I want to also go a bit further back, and you're saying that this is probably a turn for the worse for the global situation. But can you not understand that maybe these people have felt that they've been left out in politics? They feel as though across Europe you're seeing the political establishment being shaken, and it's a lot of anger, and this is just a way to be venting it. And the far-right parties are just taking this anger and using it for their own political advantage, rather than this being a genuine people distrusting refugees.
Isn't this what Hitler did? Isn't this how Hitler got his power?
I'm not an expert in German history, but from my understandings of the events that did happen, it wasn't blamed on refugees, but rather the Jews.
I wasn't talking about that. I was talking about getting the political dissatisfaction and frustration towards the government and using it in their favor. Because given obviously this is the reason why citizens being left out is the reason why citizens are turning to far-right parties. But is this the right orientation, and is this the right way to go? Because there are always going to be, for example, in Greece, within countries with economic and financial problems, with which are in a fairly difficult position. Politics and politicians have to deal with many things. I'm not justifying it. I'm just objectively speaking, say that austerity needed to be imposed in Greece. Either this is correct or not. I'm not having an opinion on that. I do have, but I'm not saying it. But my point being that political frustration is reasonable, and this is something that the government and the other parties and other organizations should fight in order for us not to turn to an age where globalization is not even an option, in which European Union, United Nations have no power, in where people will not be able to freely move around the globe. And I think that I'm talking for myself, I for one could not imagine such a word. I haven't met one, and I'm not willing to.
I want to go back again to something you said. You said that far-right parties are taking advantage of this situation in Europe now with refugees to gain support, using arguments such as, there's that refugees are maybe shaking up society or taking advantage even of society. And you're comparing that to Hitler, but I think we should be careful making that comparison, because aren't all political parties doing this? Don't they look at people's grievances, look at what they think is wrong, and use that to adjust their policies to satisfy people? I mean, because they just want to be in office, and I think that's a strategy not just utilized by extreme parties, but all parties in some way. So, yeah, far-right parties, some of them, you can call them extreme, racist, even fascist. But I think we should be careful as well, just calling them, comparing them with Hitler.
I think that exactly because it is a political way of it's a way of gaining power. That's what Hitler used. That's what pretty much this is politics. That's what people do. They try to convince people that their situation and gain their power from their from people not being satisfied with what they have. Although in the beginning I said that they take advantage of the whole frustration in the society, not specifically because of the refugee. The refugees are just one part of the problem. The general situation of people being unhappy of their governments derives from many factors, as well as the economic crisis, as well as the refugees, as well from many factors. The thing is that the far-right parties take rise from that, and not only that, they also manage to impose their ideas on these people. For example, seeing people, families with children going to protests, protesting against immigration and against Islamization. It's children who have never met a Muslim person, but they are protesting against them.
Well, would you say that the increase in terrorist attacks in Europe also increases support for far-right parties?
Yeah, that's what I was saying. It's like many factors lead to that. For example, terrorist attacks may lead to insecurity. So that's how the people see that their government can no longer provide them with security. So there's one more factor leading them towards this orientation. And I am not politically speaking, but given the history and the historical background of such movements, it's exactly what Hannik talked about. It's like I mentioned me stating, I am really anxious about this domination, because having in Sweden as well, which Sweden might be considered quite a peaceful country, I think they're Swedish Democrats. That's how they call the party is called. They're the third most popular party. And their people showed in a documentary as well, where in the Swedish Democrats youth society, there were people who were afraid in going to places where they're thought to be for immigrants, for black people, for non-Swedish people.
Yeah, you're right about that. Even in Norway, their support for far-right parties have increased, such as the Progressive Party. But also, what we've seen in Sweden, we've seen attacks by far-right extremists on people with colored skin of other religions. So that's also an interesting thing that's also happening in society that is not coherent with this new support for far-right political parties and complaints about refugees, immigrants coming in.
I would agree. In Greece as well, what happened was that the Golden Dawn was attacking black people or Muslim people or other religion people. But it was only until they murdered a Greek person, a Greek citizen, white person, who is a rapper talking against fascism, that the people recognized that this party was a fascist party. And it was only then where people starting to shed light on what this party is all about. So I would like to emphasize on that awareness must be raised at any cost.
Thank you, Stella, for that enthralling conversation between you and Helena. Right, now we're going to move on to something maybe enjoyed by the right-wing parties, and that is a good time in the pub. So, Sean, what have you got for us this week?
Thank you, Henrik. This week we have Innis and Gunn, which is made in Scotland. It's interesting in that it's matured for 77 days in an oak cask. It's quite long, really, and those oak flavours definitely come through. Otherwise, it's a smooth beer, but honestly quite boring, I think. It's enjoyable, it goes down easily, and there's not much to say, really. I mean, it says it's got vanilla notes, but I don't really notice it. Nothing's really coming through in the aroma, but yeah, it's not a bad beer. They also do blends with rum and bourbon, but obviously don't have those today, but maybe another time.
Yeah, I just had a sip and it's very mellow. And I disagree. I mean, I can really feel the vanilla flavor. I think it's very good.
I consider it a light beer because I would agree with Helena that you can feel vanilla, but I will mostly agree with Sean because it is not a flavor staying in your mouth after you drink it.
Well, I haven't tried it, but I'm not going to try it right now. But my question is, Sean, where did you find it? Because I haven't seen it in the shops nearby.
Well, I bought it from Scotland, but you can find it in any good Tesco store. 4 for £6.
Just to be aware, listeners, we have no sponsorships whatsoever. So,
but if Tesco would like to sponsor us, we'll be more than welcome to take any donations.
and now on to finally, we'd like to introduce Cameron, who's going to be talking about electric cars and whether they are the right decision for the future. So I'm going to pass over to Cameron. Yeah.
Hello. Right. Okay, so everyone not been here for most of the session, but here we go. Electrical cars, they do more harm than good. Now, we're in a world, plagued by global warming that's suffering from erosion of the ozone layer. And often people have said that the only solution is the electric car. A classic gift from the Tesla motors that appears to have arrived in our moment of greatest need. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Electric cars, which are often said to be, they don't release any emissions, they are far more greener than our gas-guzzling neighbor cars. This is not the case. The reality is electric cars rely on exactly what we're talking about here, electric. And what produces electric? The renewable resources, of which we're only 10 to 15% of the world's energy, or the remaining 70 or so percent, that is fossil fuels. This is a very quick one, but in effect, electric cars are not the way forward. However, there are some research that I'm quite interested in that I was reading just on this weekend, and that's in Oxford. They are developing a mini sun The idea is that this sun will be used in a nuclear fusion sense to provide massive amounts of solar energy that could be harnessed as an electrical power source. So with this, we could see electrical cars and their, other components being a way forward. But for now, nuclear fusion is not a safe way. Nuclear fusion is not very well researched. And if you have to say something, electric cars are not the way forward, they're the way back, because they actually produce more pollution in the process of making them and sustaining them than a normal guzzling car does. And your only difference over a 20-year period, you'll only gain back £35 worth of investment. Our energy is just not developing fast enough for it to be worth the investment. But, anyone else want an opinion?
Well, if you say that electric cars isn't the way to go, but today, with the technology we have available today, like for everyone to use, are there any better options right now?
Well, the best options right now are to simply use hybrid cars. So these are cars that have a mixture of, using fossil fuels and electric. The best solution is probably for us to work more on renewable energy, if it's anything, because electrical cars, they're not the best choice now. Hybrids are certainly the best choice. Getting rid of the old gas guzzling cars that we had from the 60s and 50s is an even better choice, because as long as they're around, they're going to be polluting a hell of a lot more. The best choice right now has got to be hybrid. It's just that simple.
And how did we lead it to the conclusion that electric cars are better than?
How will we end up with electric cars being better, you're asking?
Yeah, as we take from the general opinion being that.
Oh, how did the general opinion end up being? Well, it was just a simple no-brainer. Most people said electric cars, they don't produce any CO2. They don't produce anything that could damage the ozone. So, de facto, they must be good. We just never considered what was the background, what was it coming from, what powers it. The indirect relations. The fact that you'd have a factory producing a large amount of this fossil fuel kind of gas into the air that would be blown over the entire world is not something we ever considered. You just think, that little car outside, you can easily see the smoke coming out the back, so that must be bad. Electric car doesn't do that, so that must be good. That's how the general consensus evolved.
But isn't that a really good thing? If you can bring that general consensus to start considering how energy is produced or even how their car is, while I agree that it's probably not the best way to go forward and it's definitely not the solution, by making it into pop culture and making it an idea that people think about and start thinking about the energy costs and where it comes from, and so doing this with an electric car is a great starting point. So while the cars themselves might not be the most efficient way, they do bring the conversation up, they do bring the topics up, and the development of the technology in the cars aren't just for the cars. So introduction of electrical batteries that are longer lasting can be applied in many different circumstances in day-to-day life, most notably probably mobile technology.
Well, that's certainly true. There have been a lot more advances in technology since we've been working on electrical cars, but as you brought that up with me, I suddenly remembered one of the other few options that was suggested back in the day, and that was hydrogen-powered cars. It was kind of suggested that when you combine the hydrogen cells within the actual, the car, what you would produce is actually, it was either O2, I think, so you're basically producing water from your car, rather than producing CO2. I think that was one of the other solutions. You're going back saying...
Yeah, one of my personal interests is climate change, and talking about hydrogen cars, you're right, the only thing they do produce is water vapor, so everyone thinks clean water. But water vapor also helps keep in these sun rays. So while it might be slightly better than CO2, water vapor is probably the second largest contributor to global warming. While it's not the most powerful, it's just that there's such a large amount of water vapor already in the sky. So methane is probably the worst producer, but it's a much smaller concentrate, and so it's a trade-off here maybe.
So basically, the answer there is that almost everything we do will have a side effect. That do we live in the short term or the mid term? Because there's seemingly no long-term solution at the moment. Or you could all decide that we could have highly well-powered bikes. That'd be, like cyclist bikes. If we had some way of making those more effective, maybe that's our only solution.
Like they're using in races, which is kind of illegal.
How are they using it in races?
Sports.
Which ones?
In sports, bicycle races in sports, some have, been suspected to be using small, motors inside their bicycles.
Yep, that'd be certainly a way forward, I think. Some of these, if we get it out of illegal use in sport and into regular use in the community, it'd be a far better use, especially if it was the type where when you cycle, that causes the gears to speed up, and then it's almost like free energy. I mean, that was an old vision of Tesla himself back in the day, the creation of free energy.
All right. I'm going to close discussions here because it has been an extremely long podcast. So, if you have still been listening, that's well done to you. I'm sure to give you a pat on the back if you do tell me the last few lines. And I'm wondering, does anyone have a thought for the week? No, we don't have a thought for a week. 1 second. So we have come up with a thought of the day, and thought of the week is, why is potato salad a salad?